Hello. Today I'm talking to one of the biggest names in aircraft leasing, and for almost two generations, one of the most influential voices in the entire industry. There is not an aerospace executive who does not drop what they are doing to take a call from Steve Udvar-Házy, not just because of his importance as a potential customer, but because he has proven over the years to be an astute judge of what equipment the airline industry will need in a decade or more's time. He co-founded ILFC, one of the companies that defined the new leasing sector in the 1970s, and went on to set up Lease Corporation, where he's now executive chairman. Many will be familiar with him as a philanthropist. His $66 million donation made possible the Dulles extension of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., that now bears his name. Steve Udvar-Házy, a pleasure to speak to you today. Let me start by asking you a very straightforward question. You've been in this industry for more than 50 years. Is this crisis the worst? And how do you see the trajectory of recovery?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and the audience. Yes, the answer is yes. This is the biggest single disruption to the commercial air transportation industry since World War II. And the dimensions of this crisis are both humanitarian, commercial, and have had left a deep scar in the aviation industry. And it will take many, many years for the airline industry to recover from this financially. Traffic will recover fairly rapidly, I think, in many segments of the world, but I think financially this has really wounded the airline industry. And if it wasn't for all the substantial government bailouts, equity injections, loans, loan guarantees, many of the world's leading airlines would not be in existence today. So it is a very, very key event. And we have never seen anything like this. The magnitude of this pandemic has really impacted the industry more than most industries in the world.
And how do you see the trajectory of us coming out of this? We've already seen a return of the US domestic air traffic market to 80–90% of what it was in 2019. Other domestic markets have come back, like China. How do you see the trajectory of recovery over the next year, 18 months?
Well, leading up to the pandemic in the first quarter of 2020, we had 5 consecutive years of strong growth. Depending on the region, it was anywhere from 4 to 10% compounded annual growth, which really means that in the last 6 or 7 years leading up to the pandemic, air travel doubled, whereas usually it takes anywhere from 12 to 15 years to double global air travel. We had sort of an accelerated trend leading up to the crisis that we faced last year. And I think part of that is because population growth, middle classes have expanded, young people have a propensity to travel. And what we have today is a huge pent-up demand for travel. Literally billions of people have been sort of imprisoned by the rules and regulations and restrictions of how to live their lives. And I think the vast majority of the population has mobility capability, are urging to travel. They're yearning to travel. They want to get back to normal lives. So I think what we will see as these travel and health restrictions are eased progressively, and they'll vary in different parts of the world, different countries, we will see a strong recovery, particularly of personal travel, leisure travel, visiting friends, families. People just want to get out and get out of this routine that they've been forced to be in for the last 15, 16 months. Business travel will recover, but I think it will be on a more cautious, more conservative basis, because companies I think, are using this pandemic as an opportunity to revisit their travel policies, how to utilize technology in lieu of actually going to another destination. So I think we will see a re-examination of how companies look at their travel policies. But I think on the human side, I think people are going to want to get back and travel, and this will be tremendously beneficial for the airline industry in the next 24 months.
And how do you see that recovery impacting aircraft demand and the age and type profile of the global fleet? I mean, we've seen hundreds of aircraft, thousands of aircraft, possibly, particularly wide bodies, parked at storage facilities around the world. You know, what's going to happen to these aircraft, and what about the new aircraft that the manufacturers are building, and in many cases storing as whitetails during the crisis?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So because of the phenomena that I mentioned earlier about this supercharged growth that the airline industry experienced leading up to the pandemic over the last 5 or 6 years pre-pandemic, due to the growth in airline travel, the growth in demand, airlines generally hung on to aircraft that they would have normally retired. And if you look at the total jet population of Western-built aircraft, about 3 to 4% of that population should be retired every year. If you're looking at a 25 to 30-year life cycle for a commercial aircraft, other than ones that are going to be converted to cargo. So let's just talk about passenger aircraft. So if you're looking at a 3 to 4% normalized retirement cycle, there should be about 800 or 900 aircraft retired every year. And what we had as a phenomenon leading up to the pandemic is we had less than half of that for the past 5 or 6 years before 2020. So now you've seen a surge of retirements, but a lot of those retirements are aircraft that in a normal cycle, economic cycle, would have already been retired. So the crisis just accelerated that retirement, but a lot of that was catch up. So in our view, there was probably about 4,000 aircraft too many at the end of 2020 that normally in a relatively stable cycle would have already been retired. So those aircraft obviously were the first ones to go. And whether they were the last MD-11s, the oldest A300s, the oldest 767s, 757s, single aisle 737 classics, some of the oldest A320s, A319s, many of those aircraft by the hundreds exceeded their normal useful life. But the airlines hung on to them because they were very interested in market share, market dominance. And now we have this shock event, and airlines had to go back and re-examine, look in the mirror, re-examine what their optimal fleets are. So every airline has sort of cut back their least efficient, least economical fleets. And also the wide body aircraft were obviously the most affected, whether it's A380s, 747s, the A340 family, 300s, 500s, 600s. Basically, a large percentage of that fleet got wiped out, and many of those will never return to service. So for those very large wide-body aircraft, it was almost like a premature retirement. Many of those airplanes will not live out 25 years of useful life. So airlines have trimmed back. They think small is beautiful again. 500-seat aircraft are not the flavor of the month. So we do see hundreds of wide bodies that have been parked and decommissioned. A percentage of those will get converted. We're starting to see A330 cargo conversions, both 200s and 300s. There is a massive pent-up demand to convert 777-300ERs to cargo because neither Boeing nor Airbus has a cargo airplane of that size. So we will see some absorption of the surplus wide bodies in the cargo space. But that's difficult to define right now because so much of the cargo is carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft. And once those go back in service, I'm not sure the growth in cargo will duplicate what we've seen in 2020 and in the first quarter of 2021. But there will be a large number of cargo conversions that will take some of the pressure off the depreciation of these wide-body aircraft. On the other side of the token, on 787s, A350s, A330neos, we are seeing strength. We are seeing a rapid recovery in lease rates and demand. So it's the very large end of the wide-body market that's really suffering the most. So to summarize, I think the replacement cycle has been accelerated. The retirement and replacement cycle was accelerated by the pandemic. And that will continue to play out over the next 24 to 36 months as more aircraft are retired. And we have a lower number of new deliveries from Boeing and Airbus, both on the single aisle and wide body. So we should be getting back to equilibrium, hopefully by 2023.
And I just want to follow up something you said there about the cargo market. And I know you said it's difficult to be precise in terms of forecasting demand for P2F conversions, but will there be a role for? We've seen a huge rise in internet shopping, in home deliveries. Will that sort of cancel out any the return of belly hold capacity, absorbing some of that demand?
Absolutely. We normally say that passenger traffic growth is going to be, over the long term, roughly 2 times GDP growth. I think because of the new phenomenon in the way people live, the way people shop, the way people want fast delivery, the way they just the whole lifestyle of how we operate has changed. And I think the cargo market will grow probably 3 times GDP growth. So we do believe that will supplement what would have been the normal growth rate in the cargo business. And that will, as I said before, will help us reach equilibrium in that the more planes are converted to cargo, whether it's 737-800s, where we're seeing a large quantum increase in conversions. A321 cargo conversions are coming on for the older serial number A321s. And then, of course, we're seeing the A330 and 777, 767s getting converted. So those are all positive trends because every plane that's converted to cargo takes the pressure off on the passenger market and yet gives these aircraft longevity, longer useful life, and a better appreciation from the investment community of the utility and the value of commercial aircraft. So I think overall it's a positive.
Great. Okay. I want to turn, you've touched on a lot of this, but I want to turn specifically to Boeing. Now, Boeing went into the pandemic already facing the catastrophe of the 737 MAX grounding. How do you see Boeing emerging from this? Will the problems with the MAX accelerate the development of a next generation narrow body? Will there be an MMA? And what about the 777X and 787? Has that long peaked as a program?
Yeah. So just to give you a small example of just one customer of Boeing and how it's affected that one customer, in this case, it's Air Lease Corporation. At the time of the grounding, we already had 15 aircraft that we had taken delivery of, and they were all out on lease to various airlines. Since the grounding in March of 2019 until today, we've only taken 5 more aircraft. So we have 20 MAXs altogether. Of those, 6 are grounded because of this latest electrical cockpit problem. Today, we should have 68 MAXs. Had this tragedy not occurred with the 2 accidents and the subsequent grounding, Air Lease Corporation today would have 68 MAXs, Dash 8s and Dash 9s in service. Instead, we have 20. So we're 48 airplanes short, okay? So that's impacted our customers. It's impacted Boeing because they haven't been able to receive the funds when we take delivery of the aircraft. And then on top of that, Boeing has about 100 787s that have been built but have not delivered. A month ago, we ourselves had 11 787s that were already built, either in Everett or Charleston, that Boeing could not deliver. They could not get a certificate of airworthiness to the country where we leased those aircraft. So Boeing has a number of issues. One is a reputational issue because the accidents demonstrated that there were some shortcomings in the Boeing internal processes and interfacing with the regulators, and perhaps too much of the regulatory oversight was handled in-house at Boeing. So there wasn't really a balanced approach. At the same time, I think quality degraded, both at Charleston, Everett, and Renton, the quality of the delivered product. And if we look at the number of things that had to be done to an airplane when it was ready for delivery, the number of defects, the number of problems, they were not really acceptable. And Boeing has not been able to correct that problem on a large scale. The second issue they have is there's a big gap in their product line between the 737 family and the 787 family. Now let's remember the 737 family went into service in 1968. That's 53 years ago. It's unheard of in aviation that you have the same basic type certificate of a 737 that was certified 53 years ago. That same family has continued for 53 years. Just think of that in the automotive business. Could we have a car today that was built 53 years ago and upgraded and modified from time to time? So what we're seeing today is the last reiteration of the 737. The Dash 7, the Dash 8, and the Dash 9, and the still yet to be tested Dash 10. So this is the end of the line for the 737 in terms of product development. The airplane has been stretched, it's been re-engined several times. The wings have been modified, the systems, the avionics, they've all been upgraded. So the 737 of today is not really like the 737 of 1968, but it's still under the original type certificate that the FAA issued. So this big gap that exists between the 737 and the 787 has been the Achilles heel of Boeing from a commercial point of view. And Airbus has exploited that very effectively. Our company, Air Lease, launched the A321LR, the long-range version, which took the gross weight of the airplane up to 97 tons. Then we launched the XLR, which goes up to 101 ton max takeoff weight, and basically can replicate what the 757s used to do. So here we have an aircraft in the 200 to 240 seat size, and Boeing does not have a direct competitor that has the same performance capabilities, the same payload, the same range, the same overall economics, plus the commonality with the entire A320 family. So that is right now Boeing's number one weakness. So perhaps in hindsight, Boeing should have maybe developed a family of new aircraft instead of jumping on the bandwagon to follow John Leahy's Neo adventure on the A320, which was a low-cost derivative, the Neo. And the response of the market to the Neo was so strong that Boeing had a knee-jerk reaction and they came out with the MAX. For a long time, Boeing was saying, no, we're not going to re-engine the 737 one more time. We're going to develop a new airplane. I think the success of the A320-21 Neo created a little bit of a panic in Seattle, and Boeing had to make the easy decision of coming up with the MAX. But that decision over the coming years will prove that there is this gap between the 37 line and the 87 line, and Boeing cannot fill that with any other derivative that they currently have in production. So This, I think, is the single largest product development dilemma that Boeing has to address. The very large end of the market, where we have the discontinuation of the 747-8 and the delayed development of the 777-9, for which airline demand has diminished significantly, because the very large wide bodies are not really the current favorites. People want smaller to medium size. So Boeing is caught in a dilemma where they have spent tremendous amount of money to rectify the problems that arose out of the 737 accidents and the grounding. And then they have the super expensive 777X program, which is running way over budget, is delayed. The cash flows are delayed. The airlines want to delay. They don't want to take deliveries as soon as Boeing wants them to take deliveries. The production rates have been cut. And then at the same time, Boeing had to reduce 787 production rates as a result of lower demand from the pandemic, from their plan to go to 14 a month down to 5 a month. So these are major financial implications for Boeing. Reduce 737 deliveries, reduce 77 deliveries. Right now, it's basically just a few 777 passenger and a few freighters. The 777 line is down to a bare minimum. So Boeing needs to refocus on how they develop a product line that's competitive with Airbus. And I would have to say right now, the A321 family is probably outselling the large end of the 737s by a margin of 4-1, 5-1, 6-1. And I think that trend will continue. But at the same time, we have a company that's been wounded by this series of tragedies, and then the pandemic, the lack of demand. And does the Boeing board have the courage and the resources now to go into a brand new program, knowing that current technology engines can only be pushed so far? They can get maybe another few percent fuel burn improvement, but there's no large leaps today in engine technology in the current architecture of jet engines. So Boeing has to think about the next 30 years, not just the next 5 years. So it's really a difficult equation for the Boeing company.
Okay, well, let's turn to Airbus now. You talked about the fact that obviously it's in a stronger position with the longer range versions of the A320neo family, and I guess the A220 as well could provide a surprise hit after the Bombardier C Series debacle. But the A380 was an expensive failure, and the A350 looks exposed in a faltering large wide-body segment. So what are Airbus's challenges over the next decade, 15 years?
Well, I think, as you may have seen in yesterday's Airbus earnings announcement, they are very focused on cost reductions, achieving greater economies in their production methodology, and logistical costs to bring together all these bits and pieces, how they assemble aircraft. I think Airbus has bit the bullet on the A380, and they're going to have to focus on reducing the cost of making the A350s so they can be cost competitive with 787 and the 777X in the future. The A330neo has probably gotten off to a slower start than they anticipated. But I think part of that is Airbus's own doing, because they flooded the market with A330 CEOs before they phased out the A330 CEOs. And so there's a large supply of A330s in the marketplace. And compared to demand, there's a little bit of a mismatch. Now, over time, that will correct itself, and the A330 will come back as a strong workhorse. But Airbus today really has two products that are built, in Europe or in Toulouse and Hamburg, and that's the A350 family and the A320, A321 family. The 220 is a very interesting addition to the line with great timing, because now the smaller aircraft in the 120 to 150 seat size have captured a new level of popularity. because airlines can use those to develop frequencies, they can develop to optimize hubs, they can do bypassing hubs. So you look at airlines like JetBlue and Air Canada and Delta, they're using the 220s very in nice ways that you couldn't do with a much larger, more expensive airplane in terms of operating costs. So we ourselves have ordered 75 220s, and we're finding the airplane is gaining popularity, especially now that the engines are performing better, the GTF engines. So that's an interesting complement to the lineup. And really, Boeing, again, does not have a direct competitor. The closest competitor is the E195-E2 from Embraer, which is also struggling a little bit with getting additional sales from large airlines. So Airbus is in a relatively classically better position today with the 220 family, the 100 and the 300, the A320, 321neo, including the long-range versions, and the A350, 900 and 1000. Now the 1000 actually is more economical if you take away capital cost than the 777-300ER. It has less fuel burn, it carries about the same payload, just as far as the 777-300ER. But the capital cost equation is a negative for the 1000. It's an expensive plane to acquire. And unless an airline can fly 5,000 hours a year, it's a tough equation to make money with the airplane. So Airbus is in a better position, but they also have to think about the future, particularly if Boeing in the next few years decides to build an all-new family of single-aisle aircraft. Then Airbus has to look at other technologies, hybrids, electrics, using different fuels, using hydrogen, part solar, part, some new technologies that are a quantum leap over what we have flying today. And I think that's what Airbus is focused on. I think Airbus does not want to do a Band-Aid airplane to replace A320, A321, because even if the operating costs of such a new plane are lower, the capital costs will offset that advantage. So I think Airbus is looking a little further down the line. And in the meantime, they can certainly enjoy the popularity of their single-aisle family. As you know, they're going up to 45 airplanes a month in 4 different production facilities in China, Mobile, Toulouse, Hamburg. Whereas Boeing is building all the 737s in one facility in Renton, which is highly unionized labor. So I think Airbus has some inherent advantages right now in the single-aisle space.
Okay, you mentioned environment there and the potential for disruptive technology. We've seen environmental awareness reach new levels, throughout the world, but that's definitely impacting on aviation. I'm going to say we've got some questions from our audience here that we've asked for in advance. One of them asks, will the economic life of today's aircraft fleet drop as environmental issues become more prevalent? And just to add to that, perhaps we could get your thoughts on how environmental awareness generally will impact the industry over the next 10 years.
So that's an extremely good question, and we are definitely seeing a much greater environmental awareness in the fleet planning process. I think led by Europe, and now with North America catching on, there is this sensation that commercial aircraft are contributing to global warming. They're contributing to emissions that the world could do without. There is almost like a massive campaign against flying. And I don't know what alternatives we have. I don't think we're going to go back and take the Queen Mary from London to New York on your next transatlantic crossing. I don't think we're going to go back to horse and buggies. So I think commercial aviation is here to stay. But what we are seeing is that governments and different semi-government agencies are going to tax and punish airlines that operate aircraft that are not the most advanced in terms of environmental compatibility, emissions, noise, fuel consumption, so forth. So I think there's going to be economic discrimination against the previous generation aircraft. And there's going to be a greater emphasis, particularly in Europe, as we've seen in France recently, to try to force airlines to reduce their short-haul flying and divert some of that traffic into trains, high-speed trains, that can hopefully connect directly to an airport for connections. I don't think we'll see that in the US because of politics, where each state has a lot of political will and power, and a lot of small communities in the US. We don't have the surface transportation infrastructure that you have in Europe. We don't have trains connecting every city in the US. So, but in Europe, definitely this is a problem. And what we are seeing now is airlines, when they talk to us, they're much more focused on kind of what's coming down the line in terms of the costs of operating these aircraft, aside from fuel, maintenance costs, crews, landing fees. They're very concerned about what are the charges that are going to be imposed on the airlines because they're operating aircraft that are sort of labeled as destroying the planet, and how much of those additional costs can they pass on to the consumer, the passenger. And you could have a situation where those incremental costs that are imposed by government agencies could exceed the cost of actually operating the aircraft, as a way of discouraging people from traveling, particularly in the short haul mode. So this is definitely picking up steam. We are alarmed by the strength of this movement, because it will affect particularly the European airlines to a much greater degree than anywhere else in the world. Now, to the extent that North America catches up with this trend that Europe has started, then where does it go next? Does it go to Japan? Does it go to places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea and so forth, Australia, New Zealand? Where does this stop? So we are very conscious of this. I do not think that the useful lives of aircraft will be materially changed, because the aircraft that become obsolete in one part of the world still have great usefulness, whether it's in Latin America or Africa or other places in the world. We have cargo conversions, we have military applications. There's all kinds of ways to redeploy these aircraft. And we've seen that when the 737 NGs came out, the 700s, 800s, 900s, that it didn't instantly obsolete the 300, 400, 500s. We were able to redeploy those aircraft in many parts of the world. So I don't really see the 25-year useful life being affected too much. Now, there may be certain types that are impacted to a greater degree, but overall, I don't think there's going to be a major change to the useful life of aircraft.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to take another question from an audience member. This says that lessors are the backbone of the aircraft market. Is their financial strength sustainable, or do you see any risk factors?
Well, in the last few months, we've had a major development in that aircraft that are leased have now reached 50% of the total modern jet fleets of the airlines. I believe Airbus came out with an announcement that in 2020, 55% of their new deliveries went to lessors. So the leasing industry has come from very humble beginnings in the 1970s to where it is today. And part of that is that the leasing companies have exhibited a greater amount of consistency and stability over the long term, and they've been impacted less by these major disruptions, whether it was 9/11, the financial crisis, and this latest pandemic. And why is that? First of all, leasing companies are not as labor intensive as airlines. You know, we operate with a very small workforce, and the total payroll costs of a leasing company are usually just a very small fraction of their total operating costs. Secondly, because of the financial performance of the leasing community and their demonstrated stability through multiple cycles, their access to capital and the cost of incremental capital, whether it's debt capital or other forms of equity, is lower than that of the airlines. In other words, the leasing community enjoys a marginal benefit versus the airline industry that they serve. So therefore, the cost of financing is lower, and that can be transmitted through the lease rates to the airline's benefit. The other factor is that a leasing company like Air Lease, for example, we buy hundreds of aircraft. So we place large orders, bulk orders, multi-year orders that amount to billions and billions of airlines. There's only a few dozen airlines in the world that have that capability to buy, say, more than 100 aircraft in one transaction. Most airlines that we deal with maybe need 5 planes in the next few years, or 10 or 15 or 20. They're not bulk buyers. So those airlines, which are the predominant number of carriers throughout the world, cannot compete in terms of the quantity of their aircraft acquisitions with the large mega lessors. So we have a cost advantage on acquiring the aircraft, and then we have a cost advantage on the financings. And that benefit, as I said, is passed on to the airlines. And that's why the airlines are relying on the leasing community to help modernize their fleets.
And just to follow up from that, I mean, the leasing industry, the leasing sector depends on having access to finance to be able to undertake these huge transactions. Do you see there being any risk there of the big banks, the big lenders wanting to move away from aviation, which for a long time was seen as a very sexy industry to be involved in? Is there going to be a wariness there from some of the lenders?
What we're seeing is the wariness is more toward the airlines, because the airlines swing from profits to huge losses. And if you take the losses since the beginning of 2020, they have more than wiped out all of the earnings of the global airline industry since World War II. So this one little over a year has been more painful than all the profits the airlines have generated in the last more than 70 years. So I think the banking community looks less at the sexiness of the airline industry and more at the financial stability of the borrower. And so in this case, companies like ourselves that serve the airlines have demonstrated more stability financially than our customers. So the credit quality of the lessor community is better than the airline community, other than the ones that have government guarantees. So the gravitation of Wall Street and the financial sources and the banks is more toward the less risky borrowers. And so that's why I think the leasing community does have some inherent advantages. Secondly, if you look at the total replacement need of the airline industry over the next 10 years, the airlines don't have the balance sheet to be able to support that on their own. The airlines are going to be constrained on how much financing they can raise. So they need a third-party type partner like a strong leasing company to basically accomplish their mission to modernize their fleets.
Okay, I mean, just moving on to the airlines, I mean, perhaps one of the counterintuitive aspects of the last year or so has been the remarkably small number of airlines that have actually gone bust during the crisis. Now, part of that has been, I guess, that governments have been prepared to step in and support in some cases. Other lenders have been patient. We've even seen startup airlines during this crisis, which almost seems crazy. Do you think there are a lot of airlines out there that are really bad debts that are hanging on by their fingernails, or a lot, almost zombie airlines really that haven't got a viable business and won't have even as we emerge from this crisis, but are just simply being held up by governments or other guarantors?
Or artificial forces.
Indeed.
Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, if we look at an airline like, say, Norwegian, which had a very successful domestic and intra-European network flying 737s, and then they morphed into this intercontinental carrier with a large fleet of 787s, where frequently the break-even load factor was over 100% if you compare the yields they were getting. So, a lot of experts in the industry would have said, okay, this business has got to fail. It can't generate a return on investment. And that airline has gone through 3 or 4 restructurings now. A lot of people have lost a lot of money, and the airline is still alive. The airline is still alive and kicking, mainly because the Norwegian government stepped in and provided certain support to bail out the airline. But if you looked at it strictly on commercial merit, the company should have gone out of business. If you look at the billions of dollars of debt and losses they've accumulated. But because of these artificial forces like government bailouts and support, many airlines that were struggling are still alive today. And as you said earlier, not that many airlines shut down. A lot of airlines have gone through restructuring processes. You take the 2 largest airlines in Latin America, LATAM and Avianca Group. They're both sort of alive and kicking. They've gone through a legal process of restructuring, eliminating debts and obligations, but it's not the classical bankruptcy and liquidation. It's more of a rejuvenation, a rebirth, rising from the ashes. And the pandemic has been the force that has led these airlines to now totally restructure their operations, their fleets, their workforce, their networks, in some cases, their alliances. So this shockwave of the pandemic has sort of accelerated the differentiation between those airlines that can prosper and have a good business case versus those that are, as you say, they're almost like they're alive zombie airlines that keep surviving, but they don't really have a sustainable commercial business. And at the same time, we have new airlines starting up. We've had a number of new carriers starting up in the US. I think one started flying this last week in California. And that's because you have cheap aircraft, you have capital, and you have a lot of crews. You have pilots, flight attendants. There's no shortage of labor. So you've got all these basic ingredients to start a new airline. And even another long-haul carrier coming out of Norway, from the founder of Norwegian, was able to raise quite a bit of money to restart a 787 operation. So it seems like there's plenty of capital that chases the exotic world of airlines. The record shows that more than 90% of that new money will be lost, but somehow people are mesmerized by going to the airline business. Certainly I was when I was 21, I started an airline, and I found out that was not the most profitable business enterprise.
Well, you've kind of just preempted my final question, which is going to be that if you could go back in time to meet the young Steven Udvar-Házy, just starting out in the world of aviation, what would you advise him to do differently, if anything? And what advice would you give to anyone starting out in aviation today?
Well, first of all, don't get discouraged. I remember when we started ILFC, International Lease Finance Corp, in 1973. And we located a Douglas DC-8 to purchase. And we had a customer for Aeromexico, and we had a seller called National Airlines, which was later bought by Pan Am. So we had a customer, we had an airplane, we had a seller, but we didn't have money. And I remember approaching many, many banks, and one of them was Bank of America. And Bank of America said, young Steven, you're a good guy, you're a smart guy, you have a lot of ambition, but we think your concept of airlines leasing planes will not go anywhere. It's a failed concept. It has no merit. And we're not about to finance any planes to a lessor. This is an industry that will never develop and there's no need for it in the airline business. So that's the kind of response I got from a lot of banks. And so my advice to a young person starting out is do not take no for an answer, and let your creativity and your passion drive through those obstacles. Because if you believe everything people tell you, you're not going to succeed. So you have to have conviction of what you believe in, if those principles are correct and they make good sense. So I would say follow your heart and your brain at the same time.
Good advice. Steven Udvar-Házy, we're so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.